I was at a neighborhood diner a few weeks ago, and I was sitting a couple booths down from this man who was, he was clearly holding court. He was leaning back, chest out, gesturing with his coffee mug while he was on this tirade about outsiders ruining the country. And he wasn't just angry, he was radiating this strange, almost infectious energy. His skin was clear, his voice was booming, and he had this level of unshakable, calm confidence, the kind you usually only see in, like, professional athletes or maybe cult leaders. He looked, and I'm being frank here, like the healthiest person in the building. Now, if you're like me, your instinct is to believe that holding on to these, narrow-minded, maybe even vile views, it must be exhausting. We want to believe that prejudice carries a psychological weight, that being wrong or cruel should make a person miserable, stressed, or at least a little frayed around the edges. We tell ourselves that the good guys are the ones who get to feel at peace. But as I watched this man laugh and just soak in the nods from his friends, it hit me that he didn't look burdened at all. He looked like he was thriving. And it turns out, from a purely neurochemical perspective, he was. While the rest of us are up late, tracking the news, worrying about the nuance of global policy, and feeling this heavy, ambiguous weight of a complex world, this man had found a shortcut. He wasn't looking at economic data or demographic shifts. He was feeding his brain a steady diet of perceived superiority and absolute certainty. And his brain, which is, indifferent to his morality, was rewarding him with a massive, sustained hit of serotonin. It feels deeply unfair. It suggests that those of us who refuse to play the game of tribalism are paying a kind of neurochemical tax for our empathy and our honesty, while the bigot next door uses this ancient biological cheat code to stay happy. To understand how this works, we have to look at a group of monkeys behind a one-way mirror, and a study that involved spraying the common cold into people's noses. Because the truth is, your brain doesn't care if your beliefs are true. It only cares about where you think you rank.
That observation is just so powerful because it forces us to confront this biological reality that's sitting right underneath all our social and political behavior.
Right. We want to believe that moral complexity is rewarding on its own.
We do.
Yeah.
But evolution tells a much simpler and maybe a harsher story. The brain prioritizes survival, it prioritizes resource efficiency, and sometimes the fastest route to those things is through this kind of manufactured status and certainty.
So we're really diving into something that feels fundamentally unjust. The idea that being rigid morally is actually beneficial biologically.
It is. That's our mission today. We want to understand the actual neurobiological and metabolic systems that are at play here.
And we've broken this deep dive down into a few crucial parts. First, we need to establish that foundational link between perceived status, serotonin, and even our physical health. We'll use those monkey and cold virus studies as proof.
Then second, we'll look at the psychological engine of certainty itself, the need for cognitive closure, and why ambiguity can feel physically painful to the brain.
And third, we'll actually define that neurochemical tax by looking at the literal metabolic cost of thinking complex thoughts.
And finally, we'll explore the path forward. How do we navigate this trade-off? How do we develop resilience and find that same neurochemical reward, but through genuine competence?
Through earned value, not cheap superiority.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with that fundamental biological mechanism. What is the core connection between our perception of where we stand in the world and the chemicals that regulate our mood, like serotonin?
I think it's crucial to first redefine how we think about serotonin. It's often called the happiness neurotransmitter in popular culture, but that's a bit of an oversimplification.
It's more than just happiness.
Much more. Serotonin is fundamentally about mood stability. It's about signaling how beneficial your current environment is. And for most of our evolutionary history, the number one indicator of a beneficial environment was your rank.
Your perceived social position in the hierarchy.
Precisely.
So my brain is constantly running this background calculation, like a primitive algorithm that's always checking. Am I safe? Am I high status? Am I winning? And that's what dictates my baseline mood.
That's a perfect way to put it. The brain adjusts the baseline of your emotional state accordingly.
Yeah.
It's not looking at your bank account or your degree, not directly. It's measuring whether you feel respected, recognized, and dominant in your immediate local context.
And this isn't a new human thing.
Oh, not at all. This mechanism has been conserved across mammalian species for millions of years. It's a resource management tool. When you perceive yourself as high status, you have access to resources, to mating opportunities, to safety. So your brain says, okay, relax, everything is stable, and it dispenses that mood-stabilizing serotonin.
The most direct evidence for this, the cleanest proof, comes from those UCLA primate studies on vervet monkeys, right?
Absolutely. The work that researchers like Michael McGuire and Michael Raleigh did back in the 80s is foundational. It's so elegant because it isolated the variable of perception.
So what did they find just at a baseline?
Well, they established that dominant male vervet monkeys consistently had significantly higher concentrations of serotonin and its primary metabolite in their cerebrospinal fluid. We're talking up to twice the concentration of their subordinate counterparts.
Wow, so double the amount. That's a huge difference just based on social rank.
A massive baseline difference tied directly to their position in the troop.
But the key part of the experiment wasn't just measuring that baseline, it was the manipulation they did. How did they prove that it was the perception of status and not just, being the best fighter that mattered?
This is where it gets brilliant. They conducted this highly controlled experiment. They physically isolated the alpha male from his troop.
Just took him out of the group.
Right, but they put him in a structure where he could still see, hear, and even smell the rest of the troop.
Yeah.
But, and this is the key, they could not see him.
A one-way mirror situation.
Exactly. So, crucially, the alpha male had not been defeated. He hadn't lost any of his strength or capability. He was still the top monkey. But from the troop's perspective, he had just vanished.
He had lost his audience. He lost his perceived position.
Precisely. And within just a few days of losing that perceived status, the alpha male's serotonin levels crashed. They plummeted right down to the levels of the lowest ranking subordinates in the group.
That's incredible. So the moment he lost the acknowledgement of his dominance, his brain reacted as if he'd been physically beaten.
Exactly. As if he'd been defeated and ostracized. And when they eventually reintroduced him to the troop, his serotonin levels only returned to normal after he reestablished his dominance in the eyes of the other monkeys.
The conclusion is almost brutally simple then. The neurochemistry doesn't care about objective reality. It only cares about the subjective feeling of where you stand.
That's right. Your brain does not distinguish between losing status and losing the perception of status. As far as the serotonin system is concerned, they are functionally identical signals of environmental instability.
So if you can build a structure where you are perceived as superior, even if it's only by a small, closed group, you trigger that same biological reward.
You trigger the reward. And that brings us to the mood regulation connection, which is strong. But you mentioned this reward mechanism is so fundamental, it goes beyond just our psychological well-being. It actually affects our physical immunity.
Yes, this is where the Carnegie Mellon studies on subjective status and immunity come in, and this connection is mind-blowing.
It is. In the early 2000s, researchers gathered about 193 healthy adult volunteers, and they asked them to rate their subjective social status. So where they felt, they ranked socially using a visual of a ladder relative to others in society.
So this isn't about their salary slip, it's their gut feeling about their social position.
It's their gut feeling. And after assessing this subjective rank, the researchers took a truly rigorous step. They quarantined the participants.
Put them in a controlled environment.
Yes, and then they administered rhinovirus, the common cold, directly into their nasal passages. They then monitored them very closely to see who actually developed clinical cold symptoms. Mucus production, coughing, the works.
So they were literally testing if believing your high status can help you fight off a virus.
And the results were just stunningly clear. People who perceived themselves as having higher status were significantly less likely to develop cold symptoms.
And this wasn't just a small effect.
No, it wasn't a minor statistical blip. The subjective belief in a higher rank translated to a measurable physical defense against a tangible pathogen.
And I remember reading that the researchers were incredibly careful to control for all the obvious factors that could be at play.
They controlled for everything you would logically suspect was responsible. They accounted for objective income, education level, current health behaviors like smoking, exercise, even baseline stress hormone levels.
And the effect still held.
The immunological benefit persisted even after controlling for all those objective factors. It points to this deep neurobiological shield that is activated purely by the perception of rank. It's a potent display of how the brain's social calculations modulate our physical health.
It's wild to think my immune system is listening to my ego.
That's one way to put it. The neurobiological correlation between perceived social hierarchy and serotonin regulation explains why subjective status and tribal belonging provide these significant immunological and psychological benefits, regardless of any objective merit or moral standing.
Okay, so if that's true, if my perception of my rank determines my physical immune response, then the easiest, most available mechanism to feel high status becomes incredibly important for survival. But how does that work in a modern office or a neighborhood? Most of us aren't in a monkey troop.
That's where we need to shift our focus from what's called socioeconomic status, or SES, to sociometric status, SMS. It's what some call the local ladder effect.
Okay, break that down for us. SES versus SMS.
SES is the objective stuff. Your income, your education level, your job title on LinkedIn. SMS, however, is your status within your immediate face-to-face groups. It's the respect, the admiration, the influence you command among your friends, your coworkers, your immediate community.
So which one is the brain tracking more closely for that serotonin reward?
The research consistently shows it's a sociometric status. The local ladder is the stronger predictor of subjective well-being. It correlates more robustly with self-reported life satisfaction, with the ratio of positive to negative emotions, much more than objective socioeconomic status does.
That makes perfect sense evolutionarily. My brain cares far more about my secure standing within my immediate tribe than my abstract place in the global economy.
Exactly. My ability to survive, historically, is far more dependent on the goodwill and support of my 10 closest contacts than on some abstract notion of my place in the national GDP.
And this is why the structure of the tribe matters so much. If you can define your local tribe and then define yourself as superior within it, that neurochemical reward flows immediately. Like the story of Elias, the mid-level analyst.
Right, Elias at the high-stakes investment firm in Manhattan. He wasn't the math genius, he wasn't the star deal closer. He was mid-level, and he was operating in an environment of extremely competitive, high-achieving peers.
So on paper, he's not the alpha.
Not at all. But he had this uncanny ability to navigate the social landscape. He was always positioned in the inner circle of the senior partners. He knew the office politics. He was at the right lunches. He had the ear of power.
And while his more, objectively productive peers were suffering from massive stress and cortisol spikes because their status was unstable.
Because their success depended on constant high-stakes output.
Elias seemed just inexplicably vibrant and untouched. He had found a stable source of perceived rank.
His brain was likely getting that sustained serotonin dose, triggered not by his quarterly output, but by his secure sociometric standing within that high-pressure tribe. He was protected by status, not necessarily by merit.
And you mentioned that even when the seasonal flu swept through the office, he just seemed fine.
The Elias anecdote really illustrates the power of tribal status over pure competence. His secure perceived rank within that inner circle buffered him, both psychologically and immunologically. His colleagues might have looked down on his networking as just office politics, but for Elias's brain, that sense of secure, high-ranking belonging was a matter of neurochemical survival.
It demonstrates how biology prioritizes status over merit, and how easily that status can be manufactured through social maneuvering or, like the man in the diner, just by inventing an inferior outgroup.
Exactly. So to circle all the way back, if the brain rewards high perceived rank, and is completely indifferent to whether that hierarchy is real or fabricated, then tribalism and prejudice become a neurochemical cheat code.
You invent a hierarchy where you're automatically at the top, and your brain rewards you with mood stability, immune protection, a sense of well-being, all without the exhausting work of genuine accomplishment.
That is the synthesis. The easiest way to achieve high sociometric status is to dramatically lower the bar by excluding others. By defining an outgroup, you immediately secure high rank for your in-group, and your brain rewards that self-defined superiority. And this sets the stage for the next crucial element, the profound comfort found in cognitive certainty.
Because status often comes with having the right answers. Let's move to that second powerful biological attractor, the sheer relief of having a firm, unshakable answer in a confusing world.
When we talk about the motivation for having clear answers, we're talking about a concept known as the need for cognitive closure, or NFC. And this is not just a casual preference for being organized. It's defined as an individual's motivated desire for a clear, firm answer to avert ambiguity.
Motivated desire. That suggests it's an active psychological force, not a passive preference.
It is. The motivation for closure is enhanced by two factors. First, the perceived benefits of resolution, things like predictability, a stronger basis for quick action. And second, critically, the high perceived costs of lacking closure. And those costs are uncertainty and distress.
We often overlook how physically painful ambiguity can be for the brain.
Absolutely. Studies on the intolerance of uncertainty show that the distress that comes with ambiguity is a key driver for things like chronic rumination and even clinical depression. The brain just struggles with unresolved cognitive load.
So if you can settle on any firm answer, even one that's factually wrong or morally questionable, you stop that agonizing engine of uncertainty.
And you gain an immediate, powerful shot of psychological relief. Certainty acts like an anesthetic against anxiety.
So, the man in the diner who had these simple, absolute answers for complex global problems, his calm confidence wasn't because he was right, it was because he had successfully shut down the pain of uncertainty. He'd achieved closure.
He had. And the way that NFC expresses itself is through a cognitive mechanism that psychologists describe as seizing and freezing.
Okay, tell us more about seizing and freezing.
Well, NFC operates through two primary tendencies. First, you have the urgency tendency. That's the inclination to attain closure as quickly as possible. The brain wants an answer now to stop the anxiety.
Get it over with.
Exactly. And second, you have the permanence tendency. That's the motivation to maintain that closure for as long as possible, which means a high resistance to any contradictory information that might threaten the answer you've settled on.
So, an urgent need for a quick answer, followed by a deep resistance to ever changing that answer.
Precisely. This inclination causes individuals to seize upon the earliest judgmental cues they encounter, the first easy narrative, the first simple explanation, and then freeze that judgment in place.
And this mechanism drastically reduces the need for more information processing.
Which is cognitively expensive. It's an efficient shortcut for making decisions, but it's terrible for intellectual flexibility.
We're definitely seeing a pattern here. The brain optimizes for efficiency, stability, and speed, even if it has to sacrifice truth or nuance to do it. What kind of behavioral traits do we see correlating with high NFC scores?
High NFC scores map very clearly onto specific personality and cognitive styles. We see strong impression primacy effects, so first impressions are really sticky and hard to dislodge.
What you see first is what you believe.
Right. People high in NFC demonstrate a greater reliance on stereotypical judgments, and they're prone to assimilating any new information into their existing beliefs rather than allowing their beliefs to be updated. And furthermore, high NFC correlates very strongly with measures of authoritarianism, general dogmatism, and a distinct intolerance of ambiguity.
And conversely, if you score low on the NFC scale, you're just more comfortable operating in those gray areas.
Low NFC correlates with greater ideational fluidity, creativity, a willingness to postpone judgment, and integrate complex, sometimes conflicting, data. But that flexibility comes at a cognitive and emotional cost, which we'll get to later.
Okay, this inherent drive for stability and clarity brings us directly to how NFC manifests in ideology and politics.
Right, and to uphold our impartial mandate, we have to stress that the motivation of NFC is content neutral. It's a preference for structure. High NFC individuals are drawn to content that promises stability, clarity, order, and uniformity over content that suggests instability, diversity, or disorder.
And how does that play out in a place like the US?
Well, studies in the US consistently find that high NFC correlates with measures of political and social conservatism. This tends to manifest as stronger support for policies that enforce a clear, traditional social order, things like the death penalty, a hawkish foreign policy, or strong border control. The emphasis is on maintaining an established, rigid structure.
But you pointed out a critical nuance that shows this isn't simply a universal conservative-liberal divide. It depends entirely on the dominant cultural context.
This is absolutely essential to understanding the mechanism. You have to look at studies conducted in, say, Poland. In those settings, researchers found that NFC was negatively correlated with economic conservatism, specifically support for a free market economy with minimal social provision.
So a total reversal from the US data. Why?
Because at the time of the study, in that specific cultural context, support for the rapid and often volatile free market was not the conventional, dominant, or solidaristic basis for a stable social stance.
I see. So the high NFC person doesn't necessarily prefer one specific ideology. They prefer the ideology that represents the dominant, conventional, unthreatened source of order in their immediate world.
Exactly. The preference is for dominant order. If complexity and ambiguity are perceived as threats, the brain seeks the most accessible and established anchor, whatever its specific political flavor happens to be. The certainty itself is the reward.
And this certainty mechanism extends powerfully into faith and belief systems too, doesn't it? It provides a massive psychological anchor.
It really does. Martin Seligman, who's often called the father of positive psychology, did extensive research looking at the correlation between different types of religiosity and psychological health metrics, especially optimism. He studied fundamentalist, moderate, and liberal believers across multiple faith traditions.
And what did he find about the relationship between the rigidity of their belief and their optimism?
He found that the fundamentalists were significantly more optimistic than the moderates, who were in turn more optimistic than the liberal believers. The firmer the belief, the higher the cognitive closure, the stronger the sense of psychological stability and optimism.
That seems so counterintuitive. You'd think that intellectual questioning should lead to growth and happiness.
It really highlights the biological cost of doubt. A massive meta-analysis found that religious doubt predicted increased depression with an effect size that was substantially larger than the protective effect of belief itself.
Wow, say that again?
In simple terms, losing certainty hurts your brain significantly more than having that certainty helps. Certainty is a profound psychological defense mechanism.
That makes the act of engaging in complex, critical thought, which inherently introduces doubt, feel like a dangerous psychological risk. You're voluntarily turning on the uncertainty engine.
Which the brain registers as distress. We even see this in the context of pure authoritarian rhetoric. Think about the studies where participants were exposed to these highly structured authoritarian speeches, including recordings from historical figures like Hitler and Kim Jong-un.
That's some heavy material to expose people to. What happened?
The participants consistently reported a worse mood. They felt negatively affected by the content of the speeches, which makes sense. Yet at the same time, they reported a higher meaning in life.
So they were unhappy in the moment, but the content provided immediate, rigid structure and meaning that their brains found valuable.
Exactly. The simple, unshakable us versus them narrative acted like a neurochemical sedative, replacing agonizing uncertainty with clarity. The psychological drive for cognitive closure, that anxiety reduction, offers a mechanistic explanation for why these ideologies provide a shortcut to life meaning and emotional stability.
This brings us perfectly to Clara's experience. I remember reading about a woman named Clara living in a post-industrial town in the UK. The main factory had closed years ago, and her entire economic future was just ambiguous, a continuous stream of maybes and not yets.
So that lack of cognitive closure created this vibrating, low-level anxiety that just never stopped. Her mind was trapped in rumination, constantly trying to solve an unsolvable problem with incomplete information.
Exactly. Then she encountered a local fringe group that offered profoundly simple, rigid answers. They laid out a narrative of external blame, it was them versus us, that required absolutely no complex analysis of global economics or local policy. They just gave me an answer.
And that fixed narrative provided immediate psychological relief.
Overnight, her chronic insomnia vanished. She found a sense of purpose and structure. The fundamentalist rhetoric acted like a fast-acting neurochemical sedative. She wasn't seeking hate first. She was seeking an anchor to stop the ceaseless pain of uncertainty.
Clara's story is such a powerful demonstration of the urgency of the need for closure. If constructive, nuanced paths to certainty and meaning are unavailable or just too difficult, the brain will always seize the fastest, firmest answer available, even if that answer is destructive. It's self-defense against the pain of uncertainty.
So we've established these two major sources of biological reward for simplicity. You have status, which gives you serotonin, and certainty, which gives you anxiety relief.
Right.
So now let's flip the coin and look at why the alternative path, the path of nuance, empathy, and complexity, is so taxing. This is where we define the neurochemical tax.
We've established that the brain is a cognitive miser. It operates on this principle of least effort. Deliberative, complex thought is intrinsically costly, so our brains prefer fast and frugal heuristics whenever they can. And this isn't a flaw. It's an evolutionary necessity to conserve a very precious resource.
And when we say costly, we need to be really clear that we are moving beyond a metaphor here, like an opportunity cost. We're talking about a literal metabolic expenditure of energy.
Absolutely. The cost is rooted in the dynamic allocation of limited metabolic resources in the brain. When we experience cognitive fatigue, or when our performance drops, for example, when blood sugar is low, or hypoglycemia sets in, that is a direct sign that the brain is hitting the limits of its energy budget.
But the research on simple blood glucose depletion being the sole cause of mental fatigue, that's been refined, hasn't it? The changes in blood sugar during demanding tasks are often too small to explain the complete performance crash we sometimes feel.
That's the critical modern insight. The true limiting resource isn't just the glucose flowing in your blood at any given moment. It's our energy reserve tank. astrocytic glycogen.
Glycogen, so the stored form of glucose, specifically stored within the astrocytes, which are the glial cells that support the neurons.
Correct. You can think of astrocytes as the energy managers of the brain. Astrocytic glycogen acts as this crucial energy shunt or reservoir. It's like a high-octane backup battery for a high-performance engine. It temporarily supports incredibly high levels of neural activity that exceed the rate at which blood glucose can be supplied immediately.
So when I'm wrestling with a profoundly complex problem, a moral dilemma, a difficult engineering challenge, or just trying to synthesize conflicting political data, I'm hitting that glycogen reserve hard.
You are. High levels of sustained neural activity rapidly deplete these glycogen stores. This depletion and repletion happen over a timescale of minutes to hours. And the brain's function in this context is modeled scientifically as an optimal control problem.
Okay, explain that optimal control perspective for us.
Now imagine your brain is an agent trying to maximize its reward over a lifetime, but it's given a strictly limited fuel supply.
Yeah.
If the agent can anticipate future resource demands, its most strategic choice is to be optimally lazy.
Optimally lazy. I like that.
It will minimize its initial effort to preserve that essential glycogen reservoir for when the stakes are truly high, or when the task demands are simply unavoidable.
It's like a self-imposed speed limit. That feeling of mental resistance I get when I look at a complex document, that's actually my brain executing a strategic decision to conserve fuel.
Exactly. What feels like mental laziness or avoidance is often a strategic decision to avoid deep resource depletion and maximize long-term reward. The brain is strategically rationing its glycogen.
So why does nuance, complexity, and moral inclusivity demand such a high metabolic cost compared to the simple, rigid belief we were just talking about?
Because nuance requires high cognitive control. It demands sustained vigilance, actively holding and manipulating multiple variables in your working memory, and complex multi-step look-ahead modeling. These functions, vigilance, working memory, executive control, they're the most metabolically expensive things the brain does. They're the energy hogs.
So if I choose the simple tribal answer, them versus us, my brain only needs low-cost pattern matching and retrieval. But if I choose nuance, well, their history of colonization is a factor, but their current policy is indefensible. My brain has to keep two conflicting complex models running at the same time.
And that simultaneous model running drains the glycogen reservoir very quickly. The model predicts this cost clearly. If you're forced to deplete your reserves on an initial, highly complex cognitive task, you will show a measurable performance deficit on a subsequent unrelated demanding task. The system is demonstrably finite.
Okay, let's bring all this together now. How do we formally define the neurochemical tax?
The neurochemical tax is the measurable biological cost incurred by choosing intellectual honesty, complexity, and moral inclusivity. This is not a metaphor.
It's a real bill to pay.
It is. Engaging with complexity, tolerating uncertainty, and extending moral concern beyond your immediate tribal boundaries, which means denying yourself those easy serotonin and certainty rewards, is genuinely more taxing to the neurobiological systems that regulate your mood and your energy.
So complexity requires the sustained use of those high-cost cognitive functions, working memory, and look ahead that drain the glycogen reserves.
And the result is mental fatigue, a reduced capacity for subsequent tasks, and a lack of the easy, stabilizing neurochemical reward that certainty provides.
It makes the life of someone who is professionally tasked with complexity, like Julian, the journalist you mentioned, feel exhausting just reading about it.
Julian's job was to report on a deeply polarized conflict in Eastern Europe, and he refused to simplify it into a hero versus villain narrative. He insisted on talking to the grieving mothers on both sides, explaining the complex historical grievances, and just residing professionally in those necessary gray areas.
And in doing so, he was fighting a constant battle against his own biology.
Exactly. He watched as his colleagues who chose to pick a simple side, one clear villain, one clear hero gained massive followings, seemed energized by the righteous fury of their audiences, and likely received huge, immediate sociometric rewards.
While Julian, meanwhile, felt the heavy biological weight of that tax. Every single time he refused to simplify the story, he was denying his brain the easy serotonin hit of tribal certainty. He was paying in glycogen depletion and prolonged psychological distress because he was rejecting the fastest path to status and clarity.
The path of intellectual honesty required him to develop a long-term psychological resilience, just to counteract the immediate biological pressure to simplify and align with the tribe. He was consistently choosing the metabolically expensive path.
It changes the entire perspective on tribalism then. It's not just a matter of poor ethics or bad information. It can be a failure of energy management. The simple answer is free. The complex answer is expensive. So if this system is so hardwired, how do we navigate this trade-off? How do we get the reward back? But honestly, without falling for the cheat code.
To find that authentic reward, we have to return to the core mechanism that regulates status and serotonin. But we have to look at it through the lens of learning and adaptation. We need to look at the serotonin regulator in the brain.
We're talking about the dorsal raphe nucleus, the DRN, and its serotonin transporter, SERT.
Right. The DRN is the major source of serotonin for critical areas like the cortex and the basal ganglia. The serotonin transporter, SERT, is what clears serotonin from the synapse. So lower SERT availability means the serotonin signal is cleared slower, resulting in a stronger, longer-lasting neurochemical message.
It's like turning up the volume and the duration of the reward signal.
That's a great way to put it. And researchers have studied SERT availability in the DRN and correlated it with behavior in social competition tasks. They found a powerful association. Lower SERT availability, that stronger sustained signal, was linked to significantly higher learning rates when participants were tracking the dominant status of their opponents.
So a stronger serotonin signal helps the brain learn and encode social hierarchy more effectively.
Precisely. And in a behavioral extension of this, individuals with lower SERT availability were more willing to engage in social competition. As the experiment progressed, they showed a stronger inclination to challenge a seemingly stronger opponent. They were driven to pursue dominant status within the group.
And was this effect limited to social competition?
Crucially, yes. The relationship between SERT availability and learning and competition was specific to social learning tasks involving the dominant status of opponents. It was completely absent during non-social learning, like choosing between slot machines with fixed payoff probabilities.
That distinction is enormous. It means serotonin is fundamentally involved in signaling the value of social dominance and status acquisition. When we choose the path of moral inclusivity, we are actively inhibiting a system designed to push us toward competition and self-defined superiority.
We are denying the immediate, powerful biological reward that our evolution has programmed us to seek. The ventral striatum, which tracks the expected value of social victories, showed a negative correlation with SERT availability during those social tasks, reinforcing the idea that a robust serotonergic signal is intimately linked to how intensely the brain values and pursues social rank.
This confirms that when we refuse the status cheat code, we're setting ourselves up for a real psychological battle. So the first step in navigating this is just acknowledging the difficult work required for intellectual honesty.
Absolutely. The path of resilience begins with recognizing that we are fighting against millions of years of evolution that are pushing us to pick a side and be certain. It is fundamentally easier and more rewarding biologically to simplify.
And the cost is incurred in what you call the isolation of being right early. You might see the truth, you might understand the nuance, but the social environment, the audience your serotonin system cares about, provides no immediate acknowledgement or applause for that complexity.
You are intellectually correct, but socially unrewarded. And that lack of immediate validation means you have to develop a long-term psychological resilience.
Yeah.
You have to create an internal scaffolding of value that is strong enough to counteract those immediate, powerful biological rewards of manufactured superiority and tribal certainty.
If you rely on external validation for nuance, you're going to lose every time.
You'll consistently lose because the brain prioritizes the fastest, easiest source of status.
So how do we get the neurochemical reward back, but authentically? The earned reward.
The good news is that the research on perceived status cuts both ways. The brain responds to where you believe you stand. Therefore, earned competence and genuine contribution can stimulate the exact same neurochemical mechanism as fabricated superiority.
So the deep satisfaction of truly mastering a complex skill or the sincere pride in a job well done, that hits the same serotonin lever as simply declaring myself superior to some arbitrary outgroup.
It does, but it requires effort, and it requires reality. The honest path requires you to consciously recognize genuine contribution and growth. You must build something real, expertise, skill, community, moral clarity, and then allow yourself to perceive and acknowledge the value of that sustained effort. That competence then provides an authentic, defensible source of status.
And the status derived from competence is stable. It's verifiable. It doesn't rely on delusion. The status of the man in the diner, that fabricated superiority, is unstable. It's dependent on maintaining the tribal delusion, which requires constant vigilance and exclusion.
That is the ultimate trade-off. The status and certainty derived from genuine competence, from engaging in the arduous, complicated work required for moral inclusivity and complex thought, provides an authentic, non-delusional source of that neurochemical reward. It is the only path that allows us to preserve cognitive complexity without incurring the unsustainable cost of the neurochemical tax.
This deep dive has provided such a compelling framework for viewing the conflict between our modern world and our ancient biology. It really helps us understand that when someone chooses simplicity and rigidity, they are choosing the path of least biological resistance and greatest immediate neurochemical reward.
Yeah, that understanding is everything. It shows us that the human brain, indifferent to morality, prioritizes perceived status and cognitive certainty because they serve as these ancient biological cheat codes for survival and well-being. The effort required for moral inclusivity and complex thought is a measurable biological cost, a neurochemical tax which must be consciously counteracted through genuine competence and acknowledged value. That provides the authentic, non-delusional source of the very same neurochemical reward.